It was 2:13 a.m. when the silence broke. The power inside Rikers Island suddenly cut out. Cameras went black. The security lights flickered once, then died. Inside cell block D, two inmates, Derek "Ghost" Malone and Luis Ortega, slipped through a vent that was never supposed to open. They crawled through a narrow metal shaft, their hands shaking as the sound of guards shouting echoed in the distance. They had been planning this moment for 6 months. Every screw, every camera angle, every guard rotation. They knew it all. Tonight was supposed to be freedom. As they reached the end of the vent, Derek pressed his face against the metal grate and whispered, "This is it, Luis, outside is right there." But before he could push it open, a red beam of light hit his chest. And then came the sound every inmate feared most. Code red. "We have a breach in Sector D." The sirens wailed. The floodlights roared back to life. And within seconds, Rikers Island, the most notorious jail in America, was locked down tighter than Fort Knox. But here's the thing. Derek and Luis weren't the first to try escaping Rikers. And they definitely wouldn't be the last. Still, the same question haunts every inmate who's ever dreamed of freedom. Why has no one ever truly escaped Rikers Island? Before the alarms and the lockdown, everything began much quieter. It started months earlier, when Derek Malone first arrived at Rikers. He wasn't a hardened killer, not yet. He was a small-time car thief from Brooklyn who thought he could outsmart the system. But inside Rikers, he learned fast, this wasn't just another jail. Rikers Island sits on 413 acres of land, surrounded by freezing waters and guarded bridges. The only way in or out is through the heavily monitored Rikers Island Bridge. Even if you made it off the island, you'd still be surrounded by miles of marshland and strong river currents. Still, Derek wasn't like the others. He had one rule: every system has a flaw. And he thought he found one. It began when he was assigned to maintenance duty. That's where he met Luis Ortega, a quiet, sharp-eyed inmate who used to be an electrician before his arrest. Luis knew the wiring of Rikers like the back of his hand. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance. Derek had the nerve, and Luis had the knowledge. Their plan? Use Luis's old wiring maps to cut power to a specific section of the prison, giving them a few minutes of total darkness. Enough time to slip through the vents, crawl toward the outer yard, and make their way to a garbage truck that left the island every morning at 4:30 a.m. But there was one problem they didn't count on. A new correctional officer named Sergeant Raymond Holt transferred from Attica Prison after a major security breach there. Holt didn't trust anyone, especially inmates, and he had a habit of walking through cell block D unannounced. One night, while Derek and Luis whispered about their plan under their breath, Holt appeared at the door, silent as a shadow. He watched them for a long moment before saying quietly, "Whatever you two are planning, forget it. Rikers swallows people who try to get smart." Then he walked away, but his words hit harder than any threat. Because at Rikers, no one gets away with anything for long. Days turned into weeks, and the plan continued in secret. Derek started collecting small pieces of wire, screws, and tools from the maintenance room. Luis worked out the timing of the guard rotations, every 15 minutes on the dot. Everything was perfect, until someone started talking. It began with whispers. A snitch in cell block D named Tiny started dropping hints to the guards that something big was going down. Tiny was a survivor. He'd sell out anyone to shave a day off his sentence. So when Sergeant Holt heard the rumor, he didn't waste time. He ordered a full cell search. They found nothing. But from that day on, Derek and Luis knew they were being watched. Every night, when the lights went out, Holt would stand in the shadows outside their cell, his flashlight turned off, just listening. Luis wanted to call it off, but Derek refused. He'd rather die trying than rot in a cage. So they moved the plan up. They would escape the next night. And that's when everything started to spiral out of control. Because when the lights went out that night, they weren't the only ones trying to escape. It was a cold, quiet night on Rikers Island. The kind of night when even the guards started to get sleepy. The air was heavy, and a strange tension hung in the corridors, like the walls themselves knew something was about to happen. Derek Ghost Malone sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the clock. 2:09 a.m. Luis was on the floor, pretending to sleep, his hand hidden under his blanket, gripping a small piece of wire he had stolen from the electrical room. They had tested everything earlier that day. The vent, the timing, the guard routes. They even practiced how fast they could crawl through the shaft without making a sound. Everything had to be perfect. Because at Rikers Island, you don't get second chances. At exactly 2:10 a.m., Derek whispered, "Time." Luis nodded and slid off the bed. He pulled out a small screwdriver he had hidden inside a roll of toilet paper. With quick, nervous hands, he unscrewed the vent's metal cover. Behind it was the dark tunnel that led toward the maintenance corridor, a narrow space that only someone desperate would ever try to crawl through. Meanwhile, in the guard tower above cell block D, a rookie officer was watching the monitors, yawning. On screen, all he saw were rows of sleeping inmates. Nothing unusual. He leaned back in his chair, sipped cold coffee, and blinked. He didn't notice the small flicker of the lights. He didn't notice Luis's wire making contact with the fuse box. Then, click. The entire block went black. The rookie jumped to his feet, spilling coffee over the control board. Control? We just lost visual on D block. Static answered him. Inside the cells, chaos broke loose. Inmates shouted, banged on doors, and laughed like wild animals. Someone yelled, "Yo! The light's out." They finally did it. Derek and Luis were already halfway through the vent, crawling fast. It was tight, hot, and smelled like rust and sweat. Every sound felt too loud. Every heartbeat sounded like a drum. "Keep moving," Derek whispered. "Don't stop." They reached a corner where the vent split into two paths. Luis checked his memory of the map. Left goes to the utility shaft. Right goes to the yard. Derek grinned. Then right it is. They crawled another 20 feet before they heard voices below them. Guards shouting orders. "Lock down now. I want everyone on the floor." The prison's backup generators kicked in, and the red emergency lights flickered on. The vent glowed faintly red. They were out of time. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed behind them. Someone else was in the vent. They both froze. A voice hissed, "You think you're the only ones trying to get out tonight?" It was Tiny, the same snitch who had ratted them out days earlier. He'd somehow broken free from his cell during the blackout, and he was following them. "Go back, Tiny," Derek hissed. "You'll ruin everything." Tiny laughed. "You should have cut me in, Ghost. But now we all leaving together." Before Derek could answer, Tiny kicked the vent panel ahead of them. The metal cracked loose, and the noise echoed through the whole corridor. Down below, Sergeant Holt heard it. He turned his flashlight toward the ceiling and shouted, "Freeze! Someone's in the ducts." The beam of light caught a glimpse of metal shifting above him. Then he pulled his radio and yelled, "Code red. Cell block D. We've got movement in the vents." The siren screamed to life again. Red strobes filled the block. Every guard on the island started moving at once. Inside the vent, panic took over. Derek crawled faster, his arms burning. Luis was right behind him, panting. Tiny was still kicking the panels, trying to force his way forward. Then a shot rang out. A single, sharp blast from below. The bullet tore through the vent, inches from Derek's hand. He gasped and almost lost his grip. Luis whispered, "We can't go back. Keep moving." They reached the last section of the shaft, the final grate before the outer yard. They could see faint moonlight shining through it. Freedom. It was right there. Just a few more feet. Derek pressed his hands against the grate and tried to push it open. But it wouldn't budge. It was welded shut. "No, no, no," he muttered. "This wasn't supposed to be sealed." Luis started to panic. They must have reinforced it since last week. Behind them, Tiny kept crawling closer. "Move. Let me through." Derek slammed his shoulder into the grate again and again until his skin tore and blood smeared the metal. He could see the night sky. He could smell the air outside. But it was useless. From below, more guards were gathering. Sergeant Holt barked, "Get the tools. Cut that vent open now." Luis looked at Derek and said softly, "It's over, man." But Derek shook his head, his eyes wild. Not yet. He turned back toward Tiny, who was now just a few feet away, crawling like a rat in the dark. And that's when Derek made a choice. A desperate, dangerous choice that would change everything. He kicked the vent panel behind him with all his strength. It snapped, sending Tiny tumbling backward through the shaft. Tiny screamed as he fell into the corridor below, landing right in front of Sergeant Holt. The guards surrounded him instantly. Tiny's nose was bleeding, and his eyes were wide. He pointed upward, shouting, "They're still up there. Ghost and Luis, they're right above you." Sergeant Holt looked up. "Not for long," he muttered. He aimed his flashlight into the vent, and for the first time, his light met Derek's eyes. Two men, inches apart, one desperate to escape, the other determined to stop him. Holt yelled, "Don't move." Derek didn't listen. He turned and smashed his fists against the welded grate one last time. And that's when the metal gave a sudden crack. For a split second, the cold night air rushed in. Freedom was one push away. But before Derek could squeeze through, something grabbed his ankle. It was Holt. Derek felt a cold, iron grip lock around his ankle. He kicked wildly, scraping his leg against the sharp edges of the vent, but Sergeant Holt's hand wouldn't let go. "Game's over, Ghost," Holt shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. The sirens blared louder now. Guards were running down the hallway below, shouting commands. The whole prison was awake. Luis froze behind Derek, his chest heaving, his face dripping with sweat. "Derek, we gotta move," he whispered. But there was nowhere left to move. The grate in front of them was cracked, but still holding. Behind them, Holt's arm was halfway inside the vent, pulling Derek backward. Derek slammed his boot down again, hard. Holt grunted in pain, but didn't let go. Instead, he reached for his radio and yelled, "I've got one in the vent. He's not getting out." Derek's heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. He looked back at Luis, his friend, his partner in this impossible dream, and said, "Go. Now." Luis shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." "Do it, Luis." Derek barked. "Now." Luis hesitated, then crawled past Derek, moving toward the cracked grate. He rammed it with his shoulder, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th hit, the metal finally broke loose. A gust of freezing wind hit his face. He could see the faint glow of New York City lights across the dark river. Freedom. He turned back to help Derek, but Derek was gone. Holt had pulled him halfway out of the vent. Luis reached for Derek's hand. "Grab it. I got you." Derek stretched as far as he could. Their fingers touched for a second. Then Holt yanked hard. Derek fell backward, crashing into the concrete floor below with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went silent. The sirens, the shouting, even the alarms seemed to fade away. Luis froze, staring down through the vent opening, watching the guards surround Derek. Blood pooled around his head as Holt stood over him, breathing hard. "Stay down," Holt barked. But Derek wasn't done. Somehow, through sheer adrenaline, he pushed himself up. His face was cut, his clothes torn, but his eyes were still wild with defiance. He spat blood onto the floor and laughed weakly. "You think this place can hold me forever?" Holt stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, "You'd be surprised how many said that before you." Then he motioned for the guards. "Take him to solitary." They dragged Derek down the hall, leaving a trail of blood behind. Luis, still hidden in the vent above, felt his heart sink. He could still escape, he was so close, but leaving now meant abandoning the only friend he had left. He looked at the open vent grate and the open sky beyond it, then back down at the corridor, where Derek's voice echoed faintly. "Don't let them break you, Luis." Luis clenched his jaw, tears welling in his eyes. He took one last look at the night, then started crawling backward into the vent. He couldn't do it, not without Derek. By the time he reached the maintenance room again, the power was fully restored. The alarms had stopped, and in the distance, he could hear the sound of heavy cell doors slamming shut. Rikers Island was on full lockdown. Every inmate was ordered to the ground. Every corridor was searched. Every vent, every pipe, every tunnel, sealed. And by sunrise, the island looked calm again. Almost peaceful. But inside those walls, everyone was whispering the same thing. Ghost tried to escape. Some said he made it to the water before being caught. Others claimed he disappeared into the tunnels below Rikers and was never found. But the truth was simpler. He was alive, barely, sitting in a pitch-black solitary cell, staring at the ceiling. And that's when he heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the vent above his bed. Tap, tap, tap. He smiled. Luis was still out there. The cell was dead silent. No sound. No movement. Just the faint buzz of the fluorescent light flickering above Derek's head. He lay on his bunk, staring up at the cracked ceiling, his face bruised and swollen. Every part of his body ached from the fall. But then, there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow knocks. Then a pause. Then 2 quick taps. Derek blinked, sitting up. He knew that rhythm. It was the same signal he and Luis had used for months during lockdown. Their secret code for still here. He looked toward the vent above his bed, a small square of metal in the corner of the cell. "Luis," he whispered, his voice rough. "You made it." He stood on his bunk and placed his hand against the cold metal. He tapped back 3 times, then 2. "I'm here too." A faint scratching noise came from the other side. Then, through the tiny holes in the vent, a folded piece of thin paper slid out and fell onto the floor. Derek stared at it for a moment, his heart racing. He picked it up slowly, unfolded it, and saw a few lines written in pencil, shaky, rushed handwriting. "Still in maintenance. Hiding in ducts. Found a way out through north drainage pipe. Need your help to reach it. Stay ready." Derek's eyes widened. Luis was alive. And he wasn't done. He looked around the cell. 2 cameras in the corners. 1 small, rusted pipe near the toilet. He knew they'd be watching him now, especially after the escape attempt. But Derek wasn't thinking about that anymore. He had just one thought burning in his mind. Luis had found another way. The north drainage pipe was part of Rikers' old infrastructure, built decades ago, long before the current security systems. It was supposed to be sealed off, but if Luis had found a way in, it could mean a second chance. A real one. But Derek also knew what came next. Rikers always responds hard after a breakout attempt. More guards, more searches, and more punishment. Right on cue, the steel door clanged open. Sergeant Holt stepped inside, holding a clipboard. He looked at Derek for a long time before speaking. "You're lucky to be alive," Holt said quietly. "Another inch, and that fall would have snapped your neck." Derek didn't answer. He just stared back, his face blank. Holt sighed. "You're done with this nonsense, Malone. Nobody gets out of Rikers. Nobody." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "But I'll tell you something," Holt added, glancing over his shoulder. "Every time someone like you tries to escape, the system gets smarter. The walls get stronger. And your chances—" He smiled faintly. "They get smaller." The door slammed shut behind him. Derek waited until the echo faded. Then he went back to the vent and whispered, "You hear that, Luis? The walls get stronger. So do we." He tore a strip from his bedsheet and dipped it into the blood from his cut lip. Then he wrote on it with shaking hands, "Wait till shift change. 3 a.m. I'll cause a distraction." He rolled up the strip and pushed it back through the vent. A few seconds later, he heard a soft tap-tap-tap in reply. Luis got it. Derek lay back down on his bunk, his heart pounding. He could already see the plan forming in his head. The guards thought they had won. They thought the escape was over. But this time, it wouldn't be about cutting wires or crawling through vents. This time, it would be about chaos. He'd give Luis the distraction he needed, even if it meant never leaving Rikers himself. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Let's finish what we started." The light above him flickered again, as if the whole prison was holding its breath. Outside, the wind howled across the island, carrying the faint hum of the city that lay just beyond reach. So close, yet impossible. For now. It was 2:54 a.m. The prison was quiet again. Too quiet. From the outside, Rikers Island looked calm. Rows of cells lit dimly, guards doing rounds, the sound of water slapping softly against the island's edge. But inside, two men were wide awake, waiting for the clock to hit 3. Derek Ghost Malone lay perfectly still on his bunk, staring at the second hand of the wall clock as it ticked closer. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward the vent. Luis would be ready by now, somewhere in the tunnels, waiting for the signal. Derek took a slow breath. His heart felt like a drum in his chest. He had no tools, no vent access, no easy way out. All he had was a plan, and the will to see it through. He whispered to himself, 3 o'clock, Holt. Let's see how strong your walls really are. At exactly 3 a.m., Derek stood up and slammed his hand against the metal cell door. Bang, bang, bang. He shouted at the top of his lungs. Guard, I need a medic. Somebody help me. The officer on night duty, Officer Dunn, looked up from his desk, annoyed. He muttered, not this again, and grabbed his flashlight. When Dunn opened the cell door, Derek stumbled forward, clutching his stomach. Something's wrong, Derek groaned. It's my chest. I can't breathe. Dunn sighed. Sit down. I'll call medical. But as soon as Dunn turned toward his radio, Derek lunged. He shoved Dunn hard into the wall, snatched the flashlight, and swung it once. The light smashed, sending shards across the floor. The officer dropped to his knees, dazed but alive. Derek grabbed the radio from Dunn's belt and pressed the button. He yelled into it. Medical emergency. Inmate down in C block. The call went through the entire control system. Within seconds, alarms blared in multiple sections. Guards running towards C block, medics rushing in confusion. But Derek wasn't going anywhere. He just stood there, breathing hard, watching the chaos unfold. This was the signal Luis needed. Meanwhile, in the lower levels of Rikers, deep in the old maintenance tunnels, Luis Ortega crouched in darkness, listening to the distant alarm echo through the pipes. That's it, he whispered. That's the signal. He moved quickly, crawling through the narrow drain passage he'd discovered days earlier. It smelled like rust and decay. Water dripped from overhead pipes, and rats scurried past his hands. The tunnel sloped downward, leading to the north drainage line, a massive, corroded pipe that emptied into the East River. No cameras, no guards, just a thick steel grate standing between him and open water. Luis reached the grate and pulled out a makeshift tool he'd fashioned from a bent metal bracket. He wedged it between the bolts, grunting softly as he worked. One by one, the bolts came loose. Come on, he muttered. He could hear shouting above him now, guards responding to Derek's medical emergency. The whole block was in motion. That meant fewer eyes down here. He had to move fast. He twisted the final bolt free, and the grate dropped forward with a metallic groan. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of salt water. The East River was right there, just a few feet away. Luis froze for a second, staring out at the dark, churning water. Freedom. He climbed forward, his hands trembling. He was halfway through the pipe when he heard something behind him. A splash. He turned his head. In the faint light from his stolen flashlight, he saw movement. Two shadows in the tunnel behind him. Freeze, a voice barked. Luis's heart stopped. It was a guard patrol. 2 officers sweeping the lower tunnels after the blackout incident. Luis didn't hesitate. He kicked the flashlight into the water, plunging everything into darkness. Then he crawled faster than he ever had in his life. Stop. Don't move, one of the guards shouted, his voice echoing in the metal pipe. But Luis was already at the edge. He could see the open river below. The cold night air hit his face. He looked back one last time and whispered, "For you, Ghost." Then he jumped. The guards rushed forward, aiming their lights into the pipe. All they saw was water splashing against the rocks. "Did he make it out?" one of them asked. The other guard shook his head. "No one makes it out of Rikers." But as the waves settled, something else caught their attention. A torn piece of cloth caught on the edge of the drainage grate, fluttering in the wind. It was part of Luis's prison uniform. Back in solitary, Derek sat quietly as guards rushed past his cell. He could hear the muffled chaos from below, radios crackling, orders being shouted. Then came the words that made his breath catch. Possible escape through drainage line. Suspect unconfirmed. He sat up slowly, a faint smile forming on his bruised lips. He whispered to himself. He did it. Sergeant Holt appeared at his cell door moments later, breathing heavily. He looked furious. Nice try, Malone. Whoever you sent out there won't last 10 minutes in that current. Derek didn't answer. He just looked at Holt and said softly, "Then check the river and see if you can find him." Holt glared at him for a long moment before turning and walking away. But Derek never looked away from the vent. He could still hear the faint sound of water in the distance. And in that sound, he imagined Luis swimming beneath the city lights, free at last. Or maybe drowned. No one knew. Because at Rikers Island, stories like that never have clear endings. They vanish, just like the people who try to escape. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over Rikers Island. A thin mist rolled off the East River, wrapping the prison in a gray haze. From the guard tower, everything looked still, calm, almost peaceful. But inside it was chaos. Every hallway buzzed with radio chatter. Boats from the NYPD and Coast Guard patrolled the waters, scanning every inch of the shoreline. Helicopters hovered above the island, their rotors slicing through the fog. Word had already spread through the cells. Someone had escaped. Someone actually made it out. The inmates whispered his name like a ghost story. Luis, the guy from maintenance. He's gone. No one escapes Rikers, man. Yeah? Tell that to the guys swimming in the river right now. Down in solitary, Derek Malone sat quietly on the edge of his bunk. He hadn't slept. He just listened. Every distant shout, every buzz of a radio. He was waiting for one sound, one word. Then it came. Over the intercom, a voice crackled faintly. Search teams report negative contact. No body found. Derek's eyes lifted slowly. No body. That meant Luis might have made it. He leaned back against the wall, closed his eyes, and smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but of one who finally saw something bigger than Rikers Island. Freedom. Even if it wasn't his. Meanwhile, on the mainland 5 miles away, a janitor cleaning near the Harlem River docks noticed something floating near the edge of the water. At first, he thought it was debris. Then it moved. A man, weak, shaking, covered in cuts and river mud, dragged himself onto the rocks. He looked around, gasping for air, his prison uniform torn to shreds. Then he laughed, low, almost in disbelief. Luis Ortega had made it. He hid beneath the dock until nightfall, his body numb from the freezing current. Every muscle screamed in pain, but every breath tasted like freedom. When the sun went down, he crawled up the riverbank and disappeared into the shadows of the city. He had no money, no ID, nothing. But he had one thing the others never did, a second chance. Back on Rikers, Sergeant Holt stood in the control room, staring at the screens showing endless gray corridors. An officer approached, nervous. "Sir, Coast Guards finished their sweep. Still no trace." Holt didn't look away. He just said, "Then maybe this island ain't as perfect as they think." He turned off the monitor and left the room, the echo of his boots fading into the silence. Weeks passed. The official report said the escapee likely drowned in the river. Rikers tightened security again. More cameras, new motion sensors, reinforced grates. They sealed every tunnel and vent they could find. But among the inmates, the story of Luis the Ghost grew bigger every day. They carved his name on cell walls. They whispered his story during lockdown. He became a legend, the man who beat Rikers Island. And as for Derek Malone, he spent the next 6 months in solitary confinement. Never saw the yard, never got visitors. But one night, when the guards made their final rounds, Derek found something under his pillow, a small piece of folded paper, wet and torn at the edges. No name, no signature, just a few words written in pencil. "You were right. Every system has a flaw." Derek stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in months, he laughed, A quiet, broken laugh that echoed through the empty cell. He looked up at the vent and whispered, "You did it, brother." And somewhere beyond the island, under the bright lights of New York City, Luis Ortega kept moving. Another ghost in the crowd. No one knew where he went. No one ever saw him again. But the legend lived on. Because in a place like Rikers Island, a place built to break people, even one whisper of freedom is enough to shake the walls. And that's why no one ever really escapes Rikers, except the ones who never stop trying.